Thank you, thank you. The following is one of my voiceover demos. If you're a voiceover artist and you would like to advertise one of your demos on my podcast, please send an MP3 to thedrill12, all one word, at gmail.com. That's thedrill12 at gmail.com. Back in a minute.
Americans love scenery. We want to see it all, from one coast to the next, Mount Rushmore down to the Everglades. So hop into a Chevy Malibu and take the scenic route. It's the car you knew America could build. There's a place where people count on friendships they can trace back generations, where they can count on the same stool at the coffee shop waiting for them every morning. This place is called Glen Ellen, and you can find it in every bottle of Glen Ellen wine. This is craft brewed Herman Joseph's, the smoothest, easiest drinking specialty beer in the entire solar system. And I believe you'll find drinkable in the dictionary right after don't order a beer you can't drink. Zoingo! Boingo! The freestyle pogo with more boing, more bounce. Bounce further, bounce higher with Zoingo Boingo. To see what makes Arrowhead Mountain Spring water different from those other waters, you have to go back to the source. And with Arrowhead, that means going back a little farther and longer than most. Between security challenged and security strengthened, there's one important word: how. And it is the how that makes all the difference to our nation and our world. Lockheed Martin. We never forget who we're working for. What makes Kraft singles so good? 2 out of every 3 kids don't get the recommended amount of calcium. But with Kraft singles, they get a good source of calcium and the taste they love. Kraft singles. Magic every single time. Throw boring overboard with a new real meal from Long John Silver's. A meal worthy of a plate, just $4.99. Only at Long John Silver's. We may not all be geniuses, but we can all do something smart. Introducing the Hyundai 199 Sonata Lease. It's a smart deal on a really smart car.
Good news that school shootings are on the decline in America. Yeah, school shootings are on the decline. Unfortunately, on the rise is teachers banging their students. Yeah. Which, in hindsight, was the obvious solution to that problem. Just sleeping with the weird kids, you know? Some kid in class like, oh, my English teacher's a pervert. It's like, no, your English teacher's a hero.
Good morning. It's Thursday, Bad News Thursday, September the 26th, and this is The True Conservative. Welcome to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there. I'm Ron, your host, and the only true conservative in the United States today. So today, after the Serenity Prayer and the patriotic song of the day, we will have the Patriotic Shorts, Motivation, Bishop Barron, Ayn Rand, the 33 Strategies of War, and Bad News. All that and more when I get back. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I should not change, the courage to change the things I should, and the wisdom to know the difference. Amen. Thank you. Now, Stu Varney.
Maria. Thank you. Jazz hands?
Does anybody know what he's doing? Send us a text if you know what he's doing. What does this mean? All right, have a great day, everybody. Stu, take it away. Varney Company's up now.
Oh, if you insist. Good morning, Maria, and good morning, everyone. Kamala Harris sits down for a one-on-one interview and reveals very little about her plan for the opportunity economy. She's big on holistic solutions to problems, not sure what that means, and she talked again about her middle-class upbringing. After her campaign speech and that interview, one thing is clear: government plays a central role in her economic plan. Corporations and the rich must pay their fair share. Donald Trump responding to the Iranian plot to assassinate him. He says, "No threat will shake me. No enemy will intimidate me. If Iran does anything to harm him," Trump says, "he will blow their largest cities to smithereens." To the markets, this is a rally. China has announced more stimulus measures. One analyst says Beijing has brought out the big guns. It seems to be working for Wall Street. Dow up maybe 200 at the opening bell, but look at the NASDAQ, up over 300 points. That is a rally. Bitcoin moving to $64,000 per coin, 64.4 at the moment. Not that much change for interest rates. The 10-year Treasury coming in at 380 now. That's up a little. And the 2-year, that's at 360. The gold, that's the price there right at $2,700 an ounce. That's an all-time high. Look at oil, $67 a barrel. How come it's down? Well, the Saudis have abandoned their price target of $100 a barrel. As for gas, not much change. $3.22 for regular, $3.58 for diesel. Major league political developments. New York City's mayor has been indicted on criminal charges. Several top-level city officials have resigned recently. The Adams administration is paralyzed. The city is in crisis. The Biden administration is desperately urging a ceasefire in Lebanon. Netanyahu, he's having none of it. He says Israel will fight on. On the show today, Hurricane Helene strengthens. There is real concern about a giant storm surge, likely to overwhelm some communities. The National Hurricane Center is warning anyone in Helene's path to, quote, rush to secure life and property. Thursday, September 26th, 2024, Varney and Company is about to begin.
And that was the so-called headlines. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, Varney and Company.
Here's what's just coming at us right now. We're getting more details about Mayor Adams' indictment. According to a court document, he's facing 5 separate counts: conspiracy to commit wire fraud, bribery, receiving campaign contributions from foreign nationals, wire fraud, 2 counts of solicitation of a contribution by a foreign national, and we are told any moment Mayor Adams is going to speak about this criminal indictment. All of this is happening with New York as the backdrop right now. All right, now this. Eric Adams has become the first mayor of New York to be indicted on criminal charges while in office. Federal investigators have focused on whether the mayor and his campaign took money illegally from the Turkish government. He says he's being targeted because he criticized Biden for the migrant surge. That's his defense. But his administration is paralyzed. This city is in crisis. All right, just step back a moment. New York is not alone. It may be the poster child of big city crisis, but others have the same symptoms. In Los Angeles, homelessness, crime, bad schools. In Chicago, murder, mayhem, terrible schools. San Francisco, public drug taking, homelessness, a retail exodus. All these symptoms have one cause: left-wing policies imposed by entrenched Democrat administrations. Chicago has not had a Republican mayor since 1931. San Francisco has not had a single elected Republican official since 2012. Los Angeles has not had a Republican mayor this century. And in recent years, these Democrat administrations have consistently moved further left. The progressives impose ruinous policies: defund and demoralize the police, turn the schools to political activism, but don't encourage school choice. Let them do drugs in the street. Let them steal with no consequences. The progressives are entrenched in America's biggest cities. Despite their failure, there is no sign of serious policy change and no sign that Republicans of any stripe will take the mayor's office anytime soon. The decline of Democrat-run big cities continues. Third Hour of Varney starts now.
And that was Varney and Company. Non-profit news now. Thank you. And now, the patriotic short.
Sometimes it takes the horror of war to bring out the best of humanity. Unexpected acts of mercy from the unlikeliest of places. It was December 20th, 1943, and Lieutenant Charlie Brown's B-17 bomber named Ye Old Pub was crippled and struggling to make it out of German airspace following a bombing mission over Bremen. German fighters scrambled as the listing bomber fell further and further out of formation. The first to reach it was German ace Franz Stigler, who pulled up to the defenseless bomber and saw the terrified and wounded crew. Miraculously, instead of squeezing off a round of gunfire, Stigler escorted the plane out of German airspace, even shielding it from other fighters. Brown made it home and served out the rest of the war, never mentioning the incident. Stigler did the same. In 1990, they met for the first time and became best of friends. "I wouldn't be here if not for your mercy," Brown said. Charlie Brown and Franz Stigler passed away within months of each other in 2008.
And that was the patriotic short. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now a little bit of motivation.
Some of y'all, you delusional. I just need you to do me a favor. When you are delusional, you can never get the outcomes you want because the premise in which you're operating from is a lie. So you got to work from truth. And some of us don't want to deal with truth because it's so difficult. E.T., you dropped out of school. E.T., you grew up in a certain community. In order for you to be able to do what you need to do like a Tony Robbins, there's some things that you don't have in your arsenal that if you can just admit you don't have it in your arsenal, then you can go get it. But until you admit that you don't have it, you'll never be able to do it. So I need you to do me a huge favor. I just need you to be real. And the reason why a lot of y'all don't want to be real, because some of you would rather be in a lie and at least have a lie than not have anything at all. You already know the reality about that relationship. You already know that job, your boss ain't about to cash you out. You're just scared to quit and start your own business because you don't know if you're going to do well or not. You know you shouldn't. Come on, be honest. You know you still shouldn't be at that job right now. You still shouldn't be at that job, but you're delusional. That one day is going to be your day. That one day you're going to merge your job and your calling together. It's not going to happen. You're going to have to just leave. Right? Was that the last one, son? Oh, the dream will destroy you. Right? Let it. The first version of Eric Thomas would never be able to stand in front of you guys. The first version of Eric Thomas, the high school dropout, that guy would have never been able to stand here and help you. I had to destroy that Eric Thomas. That Eric Thomas that grew up in Detroit and had like that Detroit mentality, while I love it, it doesn't transfer to every community. I had to let the dream destroy you. Let it strip you. Let it remake and mold you. Don't be afraid. Some of you are afraid. Listen to me. Wherever you from, if that's where you from, if you leave, you can always come back. I promise you. I promise you when you come back, you can get right back in the conversation. Ain't nothing gonna change. I promise you, whatever world you're from, if you go to other worlds, you can always go back to that world. Are you listening to me? Let it destroy you. So I was talking to a coach yesterday, NBA coach. I've been wanting this opportunity for my whole, for a long, long time. And coach called me, right? Let it destroy you. And my natural personality is for real, bro. I want to barter. You know, let's do it. You know what I'm saying? I give you this, you give me that. Let's barter. We ain't got to necessarily exchange money, but let's barter. So coach hit me up and was like, yo, we'd love to, we'd love to have you come to practice. We'd love to bring you to the game. We'd like to have you on the jumbo screen. We'd love to have you come out in the crowd, meet you. I was like, that's cool, coach, but I eat now from the NBA. I could have been in any Alabama game. I ain't been to none. I don't do that, coach. I need a check. I hit C, like, C, I need this letter. Will you write this for me? I'm going to send it. Destroyed me, meaning that, you know how hard it was to send that letter? Because I understood if I sent that letter, that letter was only going to do one or two things. That's what you're scared of. You scared to get to the real answer. Once I sent my man that letter, only two things going to happen. One, he going to pay me, or two, he going to say, no, thank you. And that's what you're afraid of. You're afraid to get to the real answer. And yes, while it hurt, I let it destroy me, meaning what? Every time I do it, it's that much easier for me to do it. And what I had to think about was, yo, bro, if you don't want to pay me and you know what I do, then that means you looking out for you. Why? Because you getting a check. That's what I love about folk, bro. You getting a check. You making millions as a coach. If you really think I'm as good as you think I am, and you just told me what I could do for the team, if you getting a check every time they do better, then why wouldn't you give me a check and bring me in? So really you showing your hand. What you really telling me is you don't really value me, because if you really value me, you cut the check. But what you tell me is I have to talk to front office. You ain't got to talk to front office. You got juice. So do me a favor, let it destroy you. The version of you that you are right now is a blessing, but it won't take you to the next level. What got you here won't take you there. So let the dream destroy you, tear you down, redefine you, build you back up, make you stronger. But it first starts with a sound, right? There's this sound that I hear, and that sound moves me, all right? That sound moves me. So this was a sound that I heard years ago. And there are times in my life where I just stop and I play this sound because it does something for me internally. It moves me. Write that down. The very first thing that needs to happen to you every single day is you need to be moved. You need to be moved. Whatever it is that you can do literally to incite it. Listen to me very closely. When I say find something that moves you, what most of you do wrong is you're waiting for something to move you. Instead of creating the thing every day that moves you. And the reason why I say find something that moves you, because what separates humans is our effort. There's some of us, we give 70% to what we do. Some of us 80%, some of us 90%, some of us 100%, some of us 120%. And so when you move and you are moved, it allows you to operate at a whole different level. Look, I don't know what it is. I'm telling you though, stop waiting for something to move you and move yourself. Like every day, move yourself. So in the morning, move yourself. In the afternoon, move yourself. At night, move yourself. Stop waiting for life to move you and you move you. Like be very intentional and very deliberate about moving yourself. That's number one. Look, the only difference between you and I is passion. That's it. Most of you are probably more intelligent than me in this room. You are. You're probably more gifted naturally than I am. But what separates us is that I'm moved. I'm intentional and deliberate the first hour of my day of saying, E, let's go. So many of you are moving and you're moving on 70% or 80. So what happens to you is you're average or you're good, but you're not great or phenomenal. And if you can find whatever your greatness is and be that consistent. The problem with most of you, listen to me, the first thing is you are moved, but you're not responsible for your move. Everything is external that moves you. Now I want you to start moving yourself internally. I want you to be able to push your buttons. You hear people say all the time, like, yo, E, bro, I was feeling it, now I ain't feeling it. That's on you. Like you.
And that was a little bit of motivation. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now a little meditation, a blizzard in Austria. And that was a little bit of meditation. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, the Daily Stoic.
The present is all we possess. Were you to live 3,000 years, or even a countless multiple of that, keep in mind that no one ever loses a life other than the one they are living, and no one ever lives a life other than the one they are losing. The longest and the shortest life, then, amount to the same, for the present moment lasts the same for all, and is all anyone possesses. No one can lose either the past or the future, for how can someone be deprived of what's not theirs? Marcus Aurelius, Meditations, 2.14. Today, notice how often you look for more. That is, wanting the past to be more than what it was, different, better, still here, etc. Or wanting the future to unfold exactly as you expect, with hardly a thought as to how that might affect other people. When you do this, you're neglecting the present moment. Talk about ungrateful. There's a saying attributed to Bill Keane, the cartoonist, worth remembering. Yesterday's the past, tomorrow's the future, but today is a gift. That's why it's called the present. This present is in our possession, but it has an expiration date, a quickly approaching one. If you enjoy all of it, it will be enough. It can last a whole lifetime.
And that was the Daily Stoic by Ryan Holiday. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now I'm going to play for the Bishop Barron segment. He makes a big mistake here. He's having a conversation with an atheist, let's say, and he makes some big mistakes here.
Statement to the Catholic Church, the one true church. I have a problem with that.
Yeah, a lot of people do it. It annoys people who think that it means, we're right, everybody else is wrong. But that really isn't the Catholic view. We would say that the Catholic Church has the fullness of truth. We have all the gifts that Christ wanted to give his people. Doesn't mean for a second there aren't many other gifts that are distributed all over the place. In other Christian religions, in the Jewish religion, in the Hindu, Muslim, Buddhist religions. So Vatican II, for example, said that non-Christians can be saved. Even atheists of goodwill can be saved. Someone who's following his or her conscience sincerely and honestly can be saved. Now, it doesn't mean, aren't we all the same now? It means the Catholic Church has the fullness of what God wanted to reveal to his people. But there are participations in this truth all over the place. It's not simply right and wrong. It's fullness versus varying degrees of participation. Statement.
So, first of all, my conscience is the alarms are going off because everything he's saying is so convoluted. There's nothing convoluted about God. There's nothing convoluted about Jesus Christ. Anybody's making that kind of a convoluted statement is that just rings false. There's just no doubt about that. Plus, and the reason that he's in this convoluted mode is basically he's been asked to prove the existence of God and the righteousness of the Catholic Church. The proper answer to this gentleman when he said, I've got a problem with that, is so what? Okay, because what we're talking about here is theological in nature. We're talking about God and Jesus Christ. Neither God nor Jesus Christ need this man's approval for anything. And the church, created by Jesus Christ through St. Peter, doesn't need his approval either. And that's basically what he's saying is, I disapprove, and the bishop is basically apologizing. Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to offend you. No, that's absolutely the wrong way to put it. God comes first. God was here long before anybody else. We've been religious peoples, the human beings, since the beginning. If you're an atheist, you're the newcomer, burden of proof is on you. And again, the proper way for Bishop Barron to have handled this would be to tell the guy, so what? Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, the Ayn Rand thought of the day.
Do you object to the democratic process?
I object to the idea that people have the right to vote on everything. The traditional American system was a system based on the idea that majority will prevailed only in public or political affairs, and that it was limited by inalienable individual rights. Therefore, I do not believe that a majority can vote a man's life or property or freedom away from him. Therefore, I do not believe that if a majority votes on any issue, that this makes the issue right. It doesn't.
And that was the Ayn Rand thought of the day. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now the 33 strategies of war.
The anatomy of panic. In Isfahan, in present-day Iran, toward the end of the 11th century, Nizam al-Mulk, the powerful vizier to Sultan Malik Shah, ruler of the great Islamic empire of the period, became aware of the small yet irritating threat. In northern Persia lived a sect called the Nizari Ismailis, followers of a religion combining mysticism with the Quran. Their leader, the charismatic Hasan Isaba, had recruited thousands of converts alienated by the tight control of empire exercised over religious and political practices. The influence of the Ismailis was growing, and what was most disturbing to Nizam al-Mulk was the utter secrecy in which they operated. It was impossible to know who had converted to the sect, for its members did so in private and kept their allegiance hidden. The vizier monitored their activities as best he could, until finally he heard some news that roused him to action. Over the years, it seemed, thousands of these secret Ismaili converts had managed to infiltrate key castles, and now they had taken them over in the name of Hassani Saba. This gave them control over part of northern Persia, a kind of independent state within the empire. Nizam al-Mulk was a benevolent administrator, but he knew the danger of allowing sects like the Ismailis to flourish. Better to snuff them out early on than face revolution. So, in 1092, the vizier convinced the sultan to send 2 armies to bring down the castles and destroy the Nizari Ismailis. The castles were strongly defended, and the countryside around them teemed with sympathizers. The war turned into a stalemate, and eventually the sultan's armies were forced to come home. Nizam al-Mulk would have to find some other solution, perhaps an occupying force for the region. But a few months later, as he was traveling from Isfahan to Baghdad, a Sufi monk approached the litter on which he was carried, pulled out a dagger from under his clothes, and stabbed the vizier to death. The killer was revealed to be an Ismaili, dressed as a peaceful Sufi, and he confessed to his captors that Hassan himself had assigned him to do the job. The death of Nizam al-Mulk was followed within weeks by the death from natural causes of Malik Shah. His loss would have been a blow at any time, but without his crafty vizier to oversee the succession, the empire fell into a period of chaos that lasted several years. By 1105, however, a degree of stability had been reestablished, and attention again focused on the Ismailis. With one murder, they had managed to make the entire empire tremble. They had to be destroyed. A new and vigorous campaign was launched against the sect. And soon, it was revealed that the assassination of Nizam al-Mulk was not a single act of revenge, as it had seemed at the time, but an Ismaili policy, a strange and frightening new way of waging war. Over the next few years, key members of the administration of the new Sultan, Muhammad Tapar, were assassinated in the same ritualistic fashion. A killer would emerge from a crowd to deliver a deadly blow with a dagger. The deed was most often done in public and in broad daylight. Sometimes, though, it took place while the victim was in bed, a secret Ismaili having infiltrated his household staff. A wave of fear fanned out among the empire's hierarchy. It was impossible to tell who was an Ismaili, The sect's adherents were patient, disciplined, and had mastered the art of keeping their beliefs to themselves and fitting in anywhere. It did not help that when the assassins were captured and tortured, they would accuse various people within the Sultan's inner circle of being either paid spies for the Ismailis or secret converts. No one could know for certain if they were telling the truth, but suspicion was cast on everyone. Now, viziers, judges, and local officials had to travel surrounded by bodyguards. Many of them began to wear thick, uncomfortable shirts of mail. In certain cities, no one could move from house to house without a permit, which spread disaffection among the citizenry and made it easier for the Ismailis to recruit converts. Many found it hard to sleep at night or to trust their closest friends. All kinds of wild rumors were spread by those who had grown delirious with paranoia. Bitter divisions sprang up within the hierarchy, as some argued for a hardline approach to Hassan, while others preached accommodation as the only answer. Meanwhile, as the empire struggled to somehow repress the Ismailis, the killings went on, but they were highly sporadic. Months would pass without one, and then suddenly there would be two within a week. There was no real rhyme or reason to when it happened, or which high administrator was singled out. Officials would talk endlessly about a pattern, analyzing every Ismaili move. Without their realizing it, this little sect had come to dominate their thoughts. In 1120, Sanjar, the new sultan, decided to take action, planning a military campaign to capture the Ismaili castles with overwhelming force and turn the region around them into an armed camp. He took several precautions to prevent any attempt on his life, changing his sleeping arrangements and allowing only those he knew well to approach him. By making himself personally secure, he believed he could stay free of the panic around him. As preparations for the war got underway, Hassani Saba sent ambassador after ambassador to Sanjar, offering to negotiate an end to the killings. They were all turned away. The tables seemed to have turned. Now it was the Ismailis who were frightened. Shortly before the campaign was to be launched, the Sultan awoke one morning to find a dagger thrust neatly in the ground a few feet away from the position where his breast lay on the bed. How did it get there? What did it mean? The more he thought about it, the more he began to literally tremble with fear. It was clearly a message. He told no one about this, for whom could he trust? Even his wives were suspect. By the end of the day, he was an emotional wreck. That evening, he received a message from Hassan himself. Did I not wish the Sultan well? That dagger which was struck into the hard ground would have been planted in his soft breast. Sanjar had had enough. He could not spend another day like this. He was not willing to live in constant fear, his mind deranged by uncertainty and suspicion. It was better, he thought, to negotiate with his demon. He called off his campaign and made peace with Hassan. Over the years, as the Ismailis' political power grew and the sect expanded into Syria, its killers became almost mythic. The assassins had never tried to escape. Their killing done, they were caught, tortured, and executed to a man, but new ones kept on coming, and nothing seemed to deter them from completing their task. They seemed possessed, utterly devoted to their cause. Some called them hashashin, from the Arabic word hashish, because they acted as if they were drugged. European crusaders to the Holy Land heard stories about these devilish hashashin and passed them on, the word slowly transforming into assassins, passing forever into the language.
And that was the 33 Strategies of War by Robert Greene. Back in a minute. Thank you. So if you're a Democrat, you should vote Republican because there are things that don't disappear. Violence is one of them. Modernity is not distinguished by an aversion to violence. Violence is simply protean. It varies its outward form according to the social constellation at hand. Today, it is shifting from the visible to the invisible, from the frontal to the viral, from brute force to mediated force, from the real to the virtual, from the physical to the psychological, from the negative to the positive, withdrawing into the subcutaneous, subcommunicative, capillary, and neuronal space, creating the false impression that it has disappeared. Back in a minute. Thank you. In order to win, I must defeat the voters to defeat the office holders. Nancy Pelosi is only as strong as her support. I know that the vast majority of Nancy Pelosi's support is from the useful idiots. I know that the useful idiots are easy to defeat because they rely on talking points. I know that simply contradicting the talking points is enough to stop the useful idiots. I know that winning is about stopping the useful idiots, not necessarily converting them. Back in a minute. Thank you. Now, Chapter 8 of Bad News.
Chapter 8, A Moral Panic. In the previous chapters, we saw how the national liberal news media, increasingly reliant on digital advertising, subscriptions, and memberships, has been mainstreaming an obsession with race to the approval of its affluent readers. But what was once a business model built on a culture war has now developed into a full-blown moral panic. Any journalist working in the mainstream American press knows this, because the moral panic is enforced on social media in brutal pile-ons. We have all witnessed it happen if it has not happened to us personally. You say something that the Twitterati deem beyond the pale. Maybe you criticize a prominent person of color, or you express skepticism about open borders, or you suggest that someone with unpopular views should be heard out and disputed on the merits of their argument. Suddenly, you find thousands of people angrily tweeting about you, tagging your boss and your place of work, and doing their best to get the most prominent people in your field to condemn you. The criticism quickly becomes personal and abusive and turns into attempts to shame and humiliate you. Colleagues and friends join the fray, tweeting their dismay or perhaps saying they should have seen it coming. You are either chastened or fired, and everyone else learns never to allow themselves to say or even think something that could get them canceled in such a public, humiliating way. This has happened to many journalists, but the thing is, you don't actually have to weed out every heretic for public shaming to be effective at silencing dissent. After a while, people silence themselves. Who would volunteer to go through that kind of bullying when they could avoid it by staying quiet? The spectacle it creates on its own has a powerful effect on enforcing compliance, creating a public sphere in which an angry online mob has more power to silence journalists through peer pressure than do the editors of the most important news organizations in the world. If, once upon a time, telling the truth without fear or favor was the job description of a New York Times journalist, today, doing journalism without fear or favor can cost you your job, as the people supposed to be in charge of the nation's most august publications routinely capitulate to the demands of the Twitter mob. The earliest example I can recall took place in September of 2018 over the guest list for the New Yorker magazine's annual festival. The event typically features big names in music and Hollywood and politics who convene to be interviewed by New Yorker staff members. When the 2018 roster was announced, it boasted Hollywood celebrities Jim Carrey, Maggie Gyllenhaal, and Judd Apatow, as well as Stephen K. Bannon, who served as President Trump's controversial chief strategist early on and was the mastermind behind Trump's successful 2016 bid for the presidency. Bannon, a right-wing populist, had played a crucial role in setting the agenda for the Trump administration in its early days, and had infamously bragged that his media outlet, Breitbart, was the platform of the alt-right, a racist, nativist, and anti-Semitic movement. I have every intention of asking him difficult questions and engaging in a serious and even combative conversation, David Remnick, the editor-in-chief of The New Yorker, told The New York Times in advance of Bannon's appearance at the festival. He would not get the chance. Within 30 minutes of a New York Times article announcing Bannon's invitation, Apatow, Carey, and many others announced on social media that they would be boycotting the event in protest. "If Steve Bannon is at the New Yorker Festival, I am out," Apatow tweeted. "I will not take part in an event that normalizes hate. I hope the New Yorker will do the right thing and cancel the Steve Bannon event. Maybe they should read their own reporting about his ideology." It wasn't just the celebs. The New Yorker's staff, too, was in an uproar, Remnick later revealed. Big-name writers were pulling their pieces from the publication and tweeting about it, and the celebrity tweets about refusing to attend the festival were getting tens of thousands of retweets. Someone hired to write the talent bios for the festival attendees wrote an essay bragging about refusing to write Bannon's. A New Yorker staffer, Catherine Schultz, called herself beyond appalled and reported to her Twitter followers that, "I have already made that very clear to David Remnick. You can too. The Mail at NewYorker.com." Less than 12 hours after the interview was revealed, Remnick announced that he had rescinded Bannon's invitation. The reaction on social media and the disapproval of staff members was just too intense, Remnick explained in an email to the staff. "I don't want well-meaning readers and staff members to think that I've ignored their concerns." And what were their concerns? It wasn't exactly clear. The celebs mostly tweeted things like, "I am out," and "This is P.T. Barnum level horse shit." The New Yorker staff apparently objected to the fact that Bannon would be invited to the festival's after-party and paid a $200 honorarium. When Malcolm Gladwell pointed out that he thought the whole point of a festival of ideas was to encounter ideas you don't agree with, "If you only invite your friends over, it's called a dinner party," he zinged on Twitter. An editor at Maxim replied that, "We were exposed to this set of ideas in 1933 and they were in German. They aren't new or particularly well hidden today." Is Steve Bannon really close enough to being a Nazi that the American public must be protected from his presence? The Economist didn't think so. The same day Remnick rescinded Bannon's invitation, its editor-in-chief, Zany Minton Bidos, announced that Bannon would still be speaking at the magazine's Open Future Festival. "Mr. Bannon stands for a worldview that is antithetical to the liberal values the Economist has always espoused," Bidos wrote. But she went on to say, "The future of open societies will not be secured by like-minded people speaking to each other in an echo chamber, but by subjecting ideas and individuals from all sides to rigorous questioning and debate." And though a similar brouhaha began to unfold, with celebs and journalists pulling out of the magazine's event, The Economist stood its ground. "You have a very different worldview to us," was how Bidos opened her interview with Bannon, "which is exactly why we asked you to come here." Indeed. But back in American journalism, a dam had been broken. An editor at a legacy publication like The New Yorker facing public outrage from not only the public, but his own staff, would become not an aberration but a new normal, as has capitulating to the pressure. Surprisingly, it's often journalists who already have big platforms at The New Yorker or The New York Times who show up to enforce the limits of what counts as acceptable, legitimate opinion. That's what's so shocking about this censorious development in American journalism. Not that online activists would try to use their power to enforce their views, but that an older generation of journalists, people who do know better, would capitulate to the pressure. And in the wake of George Floyd's murder, this moral panic has been on steroids. Liberal media outlets have been hemorrhaging writers, editors, and even their own founders as the limits of acceptable discourse have shrunk, and the people in charge of these publications have succumbed to the pressure to undermine the platforms of people whose views anger the woke left. People have been fired for the crime of disagreeing with a person of color on Twitter, or for not promoting enough black women. Andrew Sullivan was all but chased out of New York Magazine for having heterodox views. Glenn Greenwald left the magazine he co-founded, The Intercept, after it became clear they would not let him criticize Joe Biden in the run-up to the election. In February of 2021, the New York Times pushed out longtime science reporter Donald McNeil after staffers found out he had used the N-word to clarify a question from a student about whether it's okay to use the N-word as a joke. While Dean Baquet had initially decided that McNeil's actions lacked malice, a letter from 150 staffers that went public changed his mind, and Baquet asked McNeil to resign. Instead of fighting for McNeil's job, the News Guild observed that there's never a moment when harmful racist rhetoric is acceptable. We are not defense attorneys, a Times reporter active in the union wrote on Twitter. If someone harassed someone or acted in a manner deemed unacceptable, it can still count as cause. The Washington Free Beacon, reporting on the role the union played, or rather failed to play, in saving McNeil's job, noted how many Times staffers come from wealthy backgrounds and how few actually rely on the job security the union provides, and aptly concluded that defending workers has given way to defenestrating them, especially when they violate the taboos of well-to-do progressives. It wasn't just a culture war anymore between anti-racist wokesters and what was left of old-school journalists committed to objectivity. It was a class war between highly educated young elites and their older middle-class colleagues who offended their woke sensibilities and thus, they thought, deserved to be let go. Or take Barry Weiss. Weiss was hired by the New York Times in 2017 as part of the paper's effort to broaden the ideological range of its opinion staff after President Trump's inauguration, as the Times put it. The Times, like other major American newspapers, had struggled to find op-ed writers to defend the president, given that the Republican intelligentsia had soundly rejected him, along with the entire liberal establishment. Still, after the election, there was genuflection on this point and expressions of regret by major editors. We owe it to our readers to help them hear the voices that were supportive of Trump, the Times' James Bennett told the Washington Post in December of 2016. Weiss says she was given the explicit mandate to find conservatives and other heterodox voices to publish in the Times, people who wouldn't otherwise think of the Times as a place where they would publish. But over the course of the 3 years she wrote and edited op-eds for the Times, this mandate would become not just impossible, but verboten. Weiss says that things ratcheted up gradually. Early on, I wrote a piece called 3 Cheers for Cultural Appropriation, which would never run in the New York Times now, Weiss told me. A good number of the things I wrote and commissioned would never run in the New York Times today. That's a really good indicator for how radically the Overton window has shifted between the time I joined and the time I left. What happened was wokeness, an obsession with identity politics, and a very narrow way of talking about it. Identity is the only lens that there is, and everything, no matter how unrelated, needs to tie back to race and gender, Weiss told me. Weiss had literally been given the job of challenging that orthodoxy, but it resulted in a kind of social censure of her at the Times. Some colleagues refused to speak to her. Others would subtweet her, write tweets that were obviously about her without mentioning her name, from a few desks away. Over the course of her time at the paper, the censure escalated to outright bullying. Weiss was called a liar on Twitter by her colleagues. In Slack, an online workplace messaging board, someone posted an axe emoji next to her name. And then came the Tom Cotton op-ed. On May 25, 2020, George Floyd was arrested by police officers. He would not survive the incident. Floyd was killed by Officer Derek Chauvin, who kept his knee on Floyd's neck for nearly 9 minutes, during which Floyd begged for mercy, telling Chauvin he couldn't breathe more than 20 times as the life slowly and excruciatingly was drained out of him by the officer. The episode set off nationwide protests, the streets filled with millions of protesters, people horrified by the brutality they had witnessed and anxious to see police reform. It was the nail in the coffin of any remaining polarization over race. In fact, it was precisely because of the millions of Americans on the streets that the moral panic around race was possible. A moral panic, after all, is a form of mass hysteria. What happens when enough people come to believe that some hostile force is threatening the values and safety of their society. And that hostile force is always believed to be concealed where you'd least expect it in a moral panic, in a lonely marginal spinster who's secretly a witch, in the grandmotherly daycare worker who's sexually abusing her 2-year-old charges, in the outcast teens who are wielding immense satanic power. Sometimes the object of the panic is quite novel, and at other times it is something which has been in existence long enough but suddenly appears in the limelight, explained Stan Cohen, a South African sociologist who first wrote about moral panics in the 1970s. In their 1994 book, Moral Panics, The Social Construction of Deviance, two other sociologists who study the phenomenon, Eric Good and Nachman Ben Yehuda, added another insight. For a moral panic to take off, there has to be a certain minimal measure of consensus in society. In other words, you can't have a moral panic about something a society is divided about. That's just a culture war. Moral panic only sets in when there is consensus about who can be cast as the evil other in a given society. And that evil is presented in a stylized and stereotypical fashion by the mass media. The moral barricades are manned by editors, bishops, politicians, and other right-thinking people. Socially accredited experts pronounce their diagnoses and solutions, wrote Cohen. Just as parents in the 80s were convinced that the neighbor's kid who played Dungeons and Dragons in their basement was actually a devil worshiper, and just as during this time, suburban Americans made up their minds that their toddlers' kindergarten teachers were molesting them, affluent white liberals have been persuaded by experts like Robin DiAngelo that hiding behind the smiles and tears of white people attending diversity, equity, and inclusion seminars, desperately trying to prove they aren't racists, is a deep-seated racism. It's a farcical view rendered plausible to millions of hoodwinked Americans by our newfound consensus about how bad racism is. The wall-to-wall disgust, outrage, and despair at the pure evil of Derek Chauvin's actions and his conviction for murder and manslaughter on all counts were proof of this new consensus. And yet the media drew the opposite conclusion, casting Chauvin's actions as proof of growing racism and drumming up a moral panic around the very thing that was receding. This was no coincidence. Cohen found that the media has played a key role in moral panics across history and geography, either inventing, exaggerating, or distorting the actions of the alleged malefactors who are assumed to be the source of the hysteria. This bears repeating. There can be no moral panic without the media and without a powerful social consensus. The fact that America's journalists no longer resemble Americans writ large does not mean that they are not setting the agenda for the nation. The power of the press, despite its unpopularity, is still immense. And what it has chosen to do with that power over the past decade and with exponential intensity over the past few years has been to wage a culture war on its own behalf, including by creating a moral panic around racism. Given the centrality of the press in perpetuating moral panics, it's not surprising that the New York Times would be playing an outsized role in the panic of today, especially given what we have seen in earlier chapters, how deeply bound up its business model is with the mores of affluent white liberals. But the degree to which Times reporters turned their wrath on their own in the spring of 2020 was shocking. By the time the dust settled, 5 people would no longer work there. It began in late May. The George Floyd protests, which had started out peacefully, took a violent turn in some cities. Peaceful, righteous marches turned into riots, and images of mass looting and burning buildings began to flood social media. Hundreds of stores were vandalized or destroyed in Chicago, Los Angeles, and Kenosha, Wisconsin, where police shot another black man, Jacob Blake, outside his car. The officer said Blake was reaching for a knife, which was later recovered. The violence and looting hit small businesses that were already desperately struggling amid the COVID-19 pandemic shutdown. On the nightly news, you could catch devastating interviews of weeping business owners standing next to burnt-out buildings that used to house their lives' work. In each, the proprietor maintained their support for Black Lives Matter. On May 31st, a Sunday night, the rioting escalated across the nation. A man in Louisville was shot when protesters exchanged fire with police trying to clear a parking lot. Looting continued in Manhattan and Brooklyn. Protesters smashed the windshields of police cars in West Philadelphia. A park near the White House was set ablaze while police and protesters clashed, as was a National Park Service building in D.C.'s Lafayette Square Park and the basement of St. John's Episcopal Church. Early on June 1st, reports emerged that President Trump had been briefly taken to an underground bunker, something he clearly felt deeply humiliated by. Around 8:30 the next morning, Senator Tom Cotton, a Trump ally, went on Fox News to discuss the mass destruction. He began by talking about how disturbing he found the video of George Floyd's death and insisted that he respected the rights of peaceful protesters. But we should have zero tolerance for anarchy and rioting and looting, he said. If necessary, the president should use the Insurrection Act to deploy active duty military forces to these cities to support our local law enforcement and ensure this violence ends tonight. Using the Insurrection Act was something the president had been considering, and Cotton tweeted the clip and followed it up with a few more tweets along similar lines. Anarchy, rioting, and looting needs to end tonight, he wrote, and whatever it takes to restore order, no quarter for insurrectionists, anarchists, rioters, and looters. It was harsh language, possibly suggesting actions prohibited by the Lieber Code of 1863. It is against the usage of modern war to resolve in hatred and revenge to give no quarter. No body of troops has the right to declare that it will not give and therefore will not expect quarter. Though Cotton later implied he was speaking colloquially. Here's the thing. Though Cotton's language of whatever it takes to end the violence may have seemed extreme, it was a view shared by the majority of Americans, including a large share of Black Americans. In fact, Cotton's remarks were a tamer version of what the majority of Americans believed. According to a Morning Consult poll conducted a week before Cotton's tweets, 58% of voters, including 37% of Black voters, not only supported calling in the military to suppress rioters and looters, but also supported bringing in the troops to supplement the police and address protests and demonstrations full stop. This is why the New York Times opinion section, which had plans to run 3 op-eds opposing the use of the Insurrection Act, one of them an editorial, was also on the lookout for a piece defending it. So when Cotton pitched an op-ed to the Times about how Twitter was threatening to lock him out of his account, a senior editor suggested he write up his thoughts on the Insurrection Act instead. After all, as the Times' opinion editor James Bennett would later put it, Times opinion owes it to our readers to show them counter-arguments, particularly those made by people in a position to set policy. Cotton's first draft of the op-ed was deemed strong by 2 senior editors at the Times. In it, he excoriated those defending the looting with what he called excuses built on a revolting moral equivalence of rioters and looters to peaceful, law-abiding protesters. The majority who seek to protest peacefully shouldn't be confused with bands of miscreants, he wrote. He then argued that the president had the authority to use the Insurrection Act to send U.S. troops to quell the rioting and looting if governors couldn't do it on their own. Contrary to what the New York Times publisher and standards department would later maintain, the process that followed was typical in every way. The draft went through a series of edits, fact checks, line edits, clarifications, and copy edits. There were several phone calls to the senator's office. A few lines were deleted and some language clarified. The original piece, for example, described the Morning Consult poll as having found that 58% of Americans approved using federal troops, which was changed to 58% of registered voters. By the time the piece was ready for publication, no fewer than 7 editors had worked on it, including 4 senior editors in the opinion section, a photo editor, and headline writers in the audience department. Having been approved one final time by a senior opinion editor, the piece was published on the Times website on June 3rd. And then, all hell broke loose. It began with angry Slack messages shared internally, but it very quickly erupted into a shocking public revolt. First came the oblique subtweets. As if it weren't already hard enough to be a black employee of the New York Times. And I love how in this country your job is completely tied to your health insurance. No doubt in deference to the Times' social media policies, restricting its journalists from expressing political opinions or publicly denigrating their colleagues' work. But those rules quickly went out the window. On Slack, a group called Black at NYT decided to say the column endangered black staff members, language designed to focus on the work, Ben Smith reported. They began tweeting a screenshot of the Cotton op-ed along with a caption, "Running this puts black New York Times staff in danger." The News Guild of New York, the union that represents New York Times journalists, later advised staffers that language that focused on workplace safety was legally protected, Smith discovered. Journalists from every New York Times department, including News and Opinion, followed suit, tweeting the screenshot of Cotton's headline along with the mantra. Watching on Twitter, you saw an avalanche of outrage from some of the highest profile journalists in the country, all tweeting the same words. Anyone who defended the Times' decision to publish the op-ed had their Twitter mentions fill up with brand name writers angrily calling them racist. It was astonishing to watch. People whose job it is to decipher fact from fiction, to think independently and make up their own minds based on the merits of a case, all joined in lockstep to tweet the exact same sentence, a sentence designed not to describe reality, but to carefully circumvent workplace rules. The country's most powerful and important journalists completely ceded their critical thinking skills to a higher power, the News Guild, and then the Twitter mob. Of course, there was a kind of sleight of hand at work. The real objection to the op-ed was that it voiced a heinous opinion, but the language of the objection was couched as endangering the lives of Black Times reporters. And yet, by the time thousands of white reporters retweeted these posts zombie-like on their own timelines, the distance from "this is union-approved language used to express our dissent" to "this is the truth, Black journalists will die because of this op-ed" shrank until it disappeared. And the revolt was just getting started. More than 1,000 Times employees signed a letter protesting the op-ed to the Times publisher, A.G. Sulzberger. Slack channels lit up with bulletins about how many people had canceled their subscriptions, the highest ever number of editorial cancellations in a single hour, as one news outlet gleefully reported. The News Guild weighed in. Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez demanded answers. But not everyone was on board with the outcry. In response to a letter a colleague sent to the paper's sports staff asking them to sign the letter to Sulzberger, Michael Powell, the Times reporter and Guild rep for the sports staff, wrote his own letter to the sports and Metro reporters. A sizable majority of the commentary on our NYT op-ed pages has been sympathetic to the protests and critical of Trump. Now and then, it's useful and good journalism to offer an unvarnished look at the views of 42% of the American electorate, at least. I'm sympathetic to my colleagues in this bad and emotional time in American history. It's terrible out there and often dangerous. But with deepest respect, I don't see how this op-ed puts us more in danger. I got a lot of people agreeing, not everybody, but a fair number, Powell told me. I had a number of reporters say to me privately that they very much agreed with me, including some top people, probably more of my generation, 50 and up, but not exclusively. One person told Powell he agreed with him, even though he had signed the letter protesting the op-ed. There was enormous pressure to sign that letter, Powell explained. For African American and Latino reporters, it became a sign of their solidarity with their brothers and sisters. And for white reporters, it became a test. Are you willing to stand by us? These are fairly charged times, and there's a lot of pressure to show that you're with the program. Bennett tried to answer his colleagues in a post on the Times' homepage that he linked to in a Twitter thread, and then during an excruciating town hall meeting held over Zoom that was more like a struggle session. We published Cotton's argument in part because we've committed to Times readers to provide a debate on important questions like this, he wrote in the opinion section. It would undermine the integrity and independence of the New York Times if we only published views that editors like me agreed with, and it would betray what I think of as our fundamental purpose, not to tell you what to think, but to help you think for yourself. The reactions on Twitter were brutal. Resign and advocate for a black woman to take your place. It's the only honorable path forward for you, mate. Where does this principle end? Would the Times publish an op-ed explaining the policy rationale for genocide? We're going to publish this op-ed entitled Mein Kampf by an up-and-coming politician so that our readers can be shown the counter-argument they so desperately need. But the slippage from fact to delusion was not relegated to Twitter. It bled into the Times' own coverage of the brouhaha in an article festooned with errors. The piece began by misstating the thesis of Cotton's op-ed, claiming he wished to send in the military to suppress protests, failing to include that he only wanted to do this in cases where the rioters still outnumber the police and guard combined. Even worse, in perhaps the most egregious part of the whole episode, the article was updated to name a 25-year-old junior editor as the sole editor of the piece. The op-ed was edited by Adam Rubenstein, according to staff members in the editorial department. The 3 reporters wrote. Several of them said they had not been aware of the article before it was published. This, like the summary of the Cotton op-ed, was blatantly false. Rubenstein had been the most junior of a host of editors on the piece, but his name was leaked by his own colleagues to his own paper, the paper of record, to protect themselves from the mob. The Times proceeded to string him up as the lone malefactor, dangling his name like bait in front of a rapacious mob, and the mob knew exactly what to do with that bait. The backlash against him was severe and quickly descended into anti-Semitic slurs for no discernible reason other than his name. And since it was reported in the Times, Rubenstein, the most junior person on the opinion politics team, went on to be named in piece after piece as the editor behind the Cotton op-ed, when in fact multiple senior editors had signed off on it. For days, not one of them stood up for him, as more and more pieces covering the op-ed and the fallout were published. The paper of record lied again and again about a defenseless junior editor to protect itself. It was a breathtaking dereliction of ethics, journalistic and simply human, the likes of which should shame everyone involved. Instead, it simply escalated. The reporters on the piece had reached out to Rubenstein for comment, knowing full well that Times staffers are forbidden from speaking to the press and have to refer such requests to the communications department. But anyone hoping that the standards department would correct the record was hoping in vain. We've examined the piece and the process leading up to its publication, a Times spokeswoman wrote in a statement. This review made clear that a rushed editorial process led to the publication of an op-ed that did not meet our standards. As a result, we're planning to examine both short-term and long-term changes to include expanding our fact-checking operation and reducing the number of op-eds we publish. This account of the process leading up to the op-ed's publication was fictional, joining a tidal wave of fabrications that just seemed to grow and grow. The fantasy that the piece contained errors, rather than the truth, that it simply put forth an opinion people didn't like, grew from a lie into a mass delusion. You had to buy into it and shout it from the rooftops or be called a racist and even lose your job. Soon, a vast editor's note had been affixed to the top of Cotton's piece that represented a valiant attempt to dress up the Times'
Thank you. This is
capitulation to a Twitter mob as some kind of journalistic ethic. After publication, this essay met strong criticism from many readers and many Times colleagues, prompting editors to review the piece and the editing process, it began. Based on that review, we have concluded that the essay fell short of our standards and should not have been published. The editor's note then identified a few phrases that it claimed weren't well enough substantiated. Beyond those factual questions, the tone of the essay in places is needlessly harsh and falls short of the thoughtful approach that advances useful debate, it went on, and concluded, editors should have offered suggestions to address those problems. The headline, which was written by the Times, not Senator Cotton, was incendiary and should not have been used. Finally, we failed to offer appropriate additional context, either in the text or the presentation, that could have helped readers place Senator Cotton's views within a larger framework of debate. A.G. Sulzberger, the Times' publisher, initially stood by the piece, sending an email to the staff backing its publication. But during the Friday town hall with the staff, he caved to the pressure and began using the same kind of language as the editor's note to clothe capitulation to a Twitter mob as journalistic virtue. He, along with Bennett, apologized profusely to the staff, calling the op-ed contemptuous and saying that it should not have been published. Dean Baquet, the executive editor, said he was impressed and proud of the solidarity the Times staffers had shown one another, though not, presumably, Bennett or Rubenstein. Given that this is not the first lapse, the opinion department will also be taking several initial steps to reduce the likelihood of something like this happening again, Sulzberger said in a Slack message to staffers. By that evening, Bennett no longer worked at the New York Times, and his deputy editor, Jim Dow, who finally admitted on Twitter that he had overseen the publication of the Cotton piece, was moved to another department. 6 months later, Rubenstein left the Times. It was a revolt the likes of which no one could remember, unfolding in real time on Twitter, and the message was a stark one. Run op-eds the left disagrees with at your own risk. Though 6 in 10 American voters and 37% of Black Americans may agree, if journalists on Twitter disagree, you may just find yourself out of a job. Cotton may have been closer to the person who was ultimately in charge of deciding whether or not the troops were sent in to stop the rioting. But it was Times staff who would now decide whether his view got to be published in what was once the paper of record. And if they had to force hundreds of thousands of people to affirm a fantastical version of reality as not only true, but as a moral precept, that's how it would go down. What's different now in this moment is that the editors no longer hold a monopoly on publishing power, wrote 60 Minutes contributor Wesley Lowery in an op-ed that called the brouhaha a rare case of accountability. Individual reporters now have followings of our own on social media platforms, granting us the ability to speak directly to the public. It is then no coincidence that after decades of pleading with management, Black journalists are now making demands on Twitter. But it wasn't, of course, just about Black journalists who, as Lowery rightly pointed out, are terribly underrepresented in newsrooms. It was about thousands and thousands of their white colleagues using Twitter to shut down voices they disagreed with and making the cost of airing them prohibitive. It was not Cotton who was most harmed by the Times' capitulation to its staff. It was not even Bennett or Rubenstein. It was public debate that bore the brunt of the damage, in being denied the chance to hash out the controversy rather than hide from it, to hear how the 6 in 10 Americans you disagree with think and why. The harm was not to those with the terrible, to my mind, opinion that the military should have invaded our cities to assist police who were overwhelmed by rioters, but rather to the public sphere and its guardians, the journalists whose job it is to have the humility to submit to a multifaceted, fluctuating, self-contradictory, and always evolving cornucopia of information in the pursuit of fairness and truth. These values are crucial not just to journalism, but to democracy and to freedom. These used to be the foundational values of the New York Times. Not anymore. The furor over Cotton's op-ed has ushered in a new era. Sulzberger made good on his vow to rethink op-eds generally. Cotton would be the last Republican official to grace the pages of the opinion section for a long, long time, and the last Trump supporter, despite the fact that a presidential election was being held in 6 months. For the 6 months leading up to what we were told again and again by the New York Times was the most important election of our lifetimes, we would not read a single op-ed by someone explaining why they were voting for Trump in what was once the paper of record. As one person familiar with the section told me, after June, any Times op-ed that argued for something that might be considered offensive would face an insurmountable hurdle to be published. In fact, in the wake of the Cotton debacle, the new rules for the opinion section, effectively mandated that every single op-ed editor approve of every single op-ed. This meant that an editor like Barry Weiss, who had been hired explicitly to commission op-eds that other editors would disagree with and even be offended by, had her pitches turned down again and again until her boss finally wrote to her and told her to stop editing and commissioning op-eds. As Weiss explained, part of it is that things can't get through and they get turned down. But the other huge aspect of this is the self-censorship that happens before you've even gone out to get something. Because you think to yourself, wait, I'm going to have to fight with 8 of my colleagues to try to smuggle this through, and I'm going to have to caveat and soften every line and make it a much shittier version of this argument. Is it worth taking a week to try to do that? And oftentimes you're just like, screw it, I'll get the easy piece. And I didn't want to become that kind of editor or that kind of writer. So in the summer of 2020, Weiss quit the New York Times with a blistering resignation letter. Twitter is not on the masthead of the New York Times, but Twitter has become its ultimate editor, Weiss wrote. Stories are chosen and told in a way to satisfy the narrowest of audiences rather than to allow a curious public to read about the world and then draw their own conclusions. Weiss outlined the vicious bullying she'd faced from colleagues, leading to her ultimate and damning conclusion. Nowadays, standing up for principle at the paper does not win plaudits. It puts a target on your back. And of course, it's not just at the Times. The hunt for insufficiently anti-racist Americans to name and shame has become its own genre. The Washington Post ran a 3,000-word story exposing one of its own obscure reporters for dressing up as Megyn Kelly, who was herself fired from NBC for making controversial comments about how blackface was okay when she was a kid. The New York Times ran a story about a 15-year-old who sent a private video of herself to a friend bragging about learning to drive in which she used the N-word, which another student got his hands on and saved for 3 years until he could use it to get her kicked out of college. An influencer in the Instagram knitting community was canceled for using terms associated with social justice like woke and problematic. Wine has been deemed racist. Another article insisted it's time to decolonize botanical collections by ridding the field of structural racism. Stories of this nature seem to have an unlimited audience, the way stories of crime once did for Joseph Pulitzer and Benjamin Day. That's because articles about angering a woke person or mob are crime stories for the affluent, or the closest they will come to them. They are stories of nice rich people, just like themselves, who commit crimes of thought or speech, who unintentionally fall on the wrong side of the reigning orthodoxy. And because the Twitter mob often comes after people for small infractions in the same way that it does for large ones, treating infelicities of the tongue as equal to actual slurs and hate speech, no one can trust their own ability to judge right from wrong, thanks to the ever-growing set of rules of etiquette, most of which have very little to do with actual racism. It's how you know we're in a moral panic. Only the mob has the right to judge you. And too many journalists have ceded them that right. Indeed, a huge number of the mob are journalists. Journalists from the most important newspapers in the country and the world, all tweeting the exact same meaningless sentence over and over and over again. People who had been hired to think for themselves, now mindlessly repeating a dogma like their jobs depended on it. Well, they do.
And that was Chapter 8, A Moral Panic, from Batya Unger Sargon in Bad News, How Woke Media is Undermining Democracy. Back in a minute. Thank you. This is Ron, your host, the only true conservative in the United States today, bidding adios to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there and reminding you that you are not neutral and that the government has no rights.